Few people know this, but most people don't collapse from a lack of strength. They collapse from a loss of clarity. And the curious thing is that this happens to ordinary people as well as to a Navy SEAL, someone trained in the most extreme SEAL training of the Navy, someone molded to be part of the elite soldiers of the Special Forces. There is a popular belief that these men don't feel fear, that they are immune to panic. This is not only false, it's dangerous. Because what really saves lives is not the absence of fear, it's the control of panic, and that's exactly what almost cost a SEAL his life that night. This is not a story about cinematic heroism. It's a real, raw, uncomfortable story about a near-death experience in the midst of underwater survival. A moment when strength, technique, and experience weren't enough. A moment when the military mindset needed to overcome something much more powerful than the ocean, the mind itself. Perhaps you've never been to the bottom of the ocean, but you've certainly felt your chest tighten, your breath shorten, and the urgency to solve everything now. That's where this story starts to make sense to you too, because what this SEAL learned that day isn't just useful for extreme missions, it's useful for any situation where life seems to take your breath away. Night falls differently when you're far from land. The ocean doesn't make noise to comfort, it's silent to test. It's in this dark, almost dense void that a Navy SEAL learns to listen to what isn't said. There are no applause, no witnesses, just cold water, and the feeling that the world has suddenly become too big. For Navy SEALs, silence isn't the absence of sound, it's a warning. A reminder that there, in the middle of the darkness, any mistake is costly. The body feels the isolation before the mind understands, and the heart slows as if preparing for something that hasn't happened yet. This is how many survival stories begin, without screams, without drama, just with a discreet omen hanging in the air. Those who have never been there can't imagine how heavy the silence is, and it really is, especially when you carry on your shoulders the legacy of elite soldiers and special forces. This kind of night doesn't threaten directly, she observes. The ocean seems still, but it isn't. It moves in invisible layers, just like the human mind when it senses danger before understanding why. For those who live with a military mindset, this environment is not strange, it's familiar. Yet no one enters it without respect. There's a tension that doesn't shout, only whispers, saying that something could get out of control at any moment. It's in this scenario that mental resilience begins to be tested, long before any physical action. Loneliness amplifies thoughts, transforming small signs into major warnings. And even with years of Navy SEAL training, the body reacts, because it's human. The silence becomes a mirror, reflecting doubts that no one usually admits aloud. And it is precisely there, in that almost imperceptible instant, that the line between control and chaos begins to be drawn, preparing the ground for what comes next. Being a Navy SEAL doesn't begin in the body, it begins in the mind. Even before any real mission, there's a long, painful, and silent process that molds those who stay and expels those who aren't ready. Navy SEAL training wasn't designed to create movie heroes, but to reveal limits, physical, emotional, and above all, mental. It's there that Navy SEALs learn that brute force impresses, but doesn't sustain. What sustains is discipline, repetition, and a strange intimacy with discomfort. Each exercise seems too simple at first glance, almost banal, until the body fails and the mind is forced to take control. At that point, the training ceases to be physical and becomes psychological. The candidate quickly discovers that surviving isn't about being the strongest, it's about outlasting fear itself. That's how true elite soldiers are born. Throughout this process, a dangerous idea begins to form: the illusion of absolute control. After all, those who survive weeks of extreme exhaustion begin to believe they can handle anything. This confidence is necessary, but also treacherous. Within special forces, one learns to master chaos, but never to underestimate it. The military mindset teaches that the environment will never be fair, and that advantage comes from preparation, not arrogance. Yet even the most experienced carry this false sense of control, as if training were an invisible shield against the unpredictable. And it is precisely this silent belief that makes each mission more dangerous than it seems. Because the more someone believes they have everything under control, the less they notice the small warning signs. And these signs almost always appear before the fall, paving the way for the confidence that precedes the plunge. Before any dive, there's a silent moment when everything seems too aligned to go wrong. For a Navy SEAL, this instant is almost comfortable. The body moves automatically, the result of years of Navy SEAL training, where every gesture has been repeated exhaustively until it becomes a reflex. Adjusting equipment, checking oxygen, testing the mask. Everything happens without conscious effort. This routine creates a dangerous sense of normalcy. It's like driving the same road every day and forgetting that it might still have potholes. Among Navy SEALs, experience brings security, but it also lulls the mind into a false sense of tranquility. The mind says, "I've done this before," while the environment responds in silence. And in this silent dialogue, self-confidence begins to grow without asking permission. It's not explicit arrogance, it's something more subtle, almost invisible, an excessive comfort that settles in slowly. This is the point where many elite soldiers learn the hard way that experience doesn't eliminate risk, it only disguises it. Automatic preparation is deceptive because everything seems under control, as if the sea were just another predictable scenario. The military mindset values confidence, but also demands absolute attention to detail. Even so, the human brain likes shortcuts, likes to believe that nothing will go off script. It is in this state that real danger begins to form, not outside but within. The line between confidence and carelessness is too thin, almost imperceptible, and when that line is crossed, the mistake doesn't announce its arrival. It waits for the exact moment. While the diver takes a deep breath and prepares to enter the water, everything seems too perfect. But the ocean doesn't care about history, ranks, or preparation, and it is precisely this indifference that begins to change everything in the next instant. The moment of entering the sea is always a sharp cut between two worlds. On the surface, there is still air, references, a horizon. Just below, everything changes. For a Navy SEAL, this instant demands absolute inner silence. The body glides into the cold water while the mind shuts down to distractions. It's like flipping a switch. Sound disappears, pressure increases, and focus narrows. The transition is not just physical, it's mental. The dive marks the beginning of underwater survival, where every breath needs to have purpose. Navy SEAL training teaches respect for this initial second because it establishes the rhythm of everything that comes after. There is no rush, no improvisation, only presence. The water envelops the body and demands total attention, as if saying, without words, that now the game is different. And those who don't perceive this change early on pay the price later. In the first moments below the surface, control seems absolute. Breathing is steady, movements are precise, almost elegant. The feeling is one of total control, reinforced by years of Navy SEAL training and the typical confidence of elite soldiers. The mind believes that everything will go according to plan, that it's enough to simply execute the protocol. This initial state is dangerous precisely because it seems perfect. The military mindset values focus, but also demands humility in the face of the environment. Even so, at the beginning, nothing seems threatening. The ocean is calm, even cooperative. It's easy to believe that the worst is over, when in fact it hasn't even begun. This false comfort creates a deceptive pause, an interval where attention can relax a little too much. And it is in this small space of confidence that the scenario begins, silently, to change. With the body already adapted to the depth, the underwater routine takes over. For a Navy SEAL, this is the territory of technical comfort. Navigation happens calmly, almost automatically, as if each movement had a life of its own. The hands adjust the body, the legs maintain the rhythm, and the breathing follows a measured pace, exactly as taught in Navy SEAL training. At this point, underwater survival ceases to seem like a challenge and begins to sound like standard procedure. The ocean, despite being dark, seems predictable. The mind enters a state of tranquil focus, where there is no room for doubt. It is common for Navy SEALs to describe this moment as a kind of comfortable, almost meditative silence. Everything flows, everything works, and when everything works, The brain begins to lower its guard without realizing it. This feeling of absolute control is seductive, especially for elite soldiers accustomed to mastering extreme environments. Each precise movement reinforces the belief that the situation is under control. The military mentality values this state of maximum efficiency, but also knows that it can be treacherous. When routine sets in, vigilance tends to decrease in the subtlest details. Small changes in the environment go unnoticed. Light currents, almost imperceptible variations in the water, signs that would only be noticed with total attention. That's where the danger lies. Because the ocean doesn't announce when it decides to change the rules. While the diver continues advancing, confident, the surrounding water begins to behave differently. It's not yet visible, not yet alarming, but something is no longer exactly as it was before, preparing the ground for the first clash between expectation and reality. The real problem almost never arrives with a bang. It presents itself discreetly, stealthily, like a subtle change in the water's behavior. For a Navy SEAL, accustomed to the routine of underwater survival, this type of unforeseen event is the most dangerous. The current doesn't warn, doesn't give a clear signal, it just pushes. First lightly, almost like an easily corrected discomfort. The body reacts even before the mind understands what's happening. An adjustment here, another there. Nothing alarming. But this small deviation begins to repeat itself, insistently, as if the ocean were testing its limits. The feeling of control begins to crack, very slowly. There's no fear yet, just strangeness. And strangeness, when ignored, becomes a big problem, especially for someone coming from Navy SEAL training where everything seems to have an answer. At this moment, instinct takes the lead. The body tries to compensate, correct, fight against something that hasn't yet been fully identified. This is where many elite soldiers make their first mistake without realizing it. The military mentality teaches quick reaction, but also demands precise reading of the scenario. But it takes the mind a few seconds to grasp what the body has already felt. The current gains strength, the position begins to deviate from the plan, and that tranquil routine no longer exists. Something has changed, and it changed without asking permission. The water now guides the movement, not the diver. It's not yet despair, not yet panic, but it's the beginning of the breakdown. A silent inflection point where confidence begins to be questioned, opening space for decisions that will soon be made under pressure. When the current ceases to be merely a nuisance and begins to dictate direction, instinct screams louder. For a Navy SEAL, the initial reaction is usually the most human possible: fight. Force against force. Arms tense, legs accelerate. The body tries to regain control through sheer power. It's a reflection of years as elite soldiers, trained not to retreat under pressure. But the sea doesn't respond to force in the same way a solid obstacle does. Each more intense movement exacts an immediate price. Breathing becomes shorter, rhythm is lost, and energy begins to slip through the fingers. Navy SEAL survival teaches resilience, but it also teaches economy. And at that moment, economy is forgotten. The mistake doesn't seem big at first. It seems logical. It seems necessary. It even seems courageous. The problem is that the ocean doesn't negotiate. The more you fight against it, the more it demands. Energy expenditure increases silently, almost treacherously, while the mind insists that it's still possible to resolve it by brute force. The military mentality values action, but it also demands a cold reading of reality. And there, for a few precious seconds, that reading fails. The body begins to tire sooner than expected. Oxygen is consumed faster, and the current continues strong, indifferent to the effort. It is at this point that many Navy SEALs learn a hard lesson. Not every confrontation is won by attacking. But this understanding has not yet fully arrived. For now, there is only the feeling that something is slipping away, paving the way for a bigger problem that is beginning to take shape just ahead. Failure rarely happens all at once. It arrives in stages, as if testing attention before fully taking hold. For a Navy SEAL, this moment is treacherous precisely because it doesn't seem critical immediately. Oxygen begins to decrease faster than expected, not due to equipment failure, but due to accelerated consumption. Breathing is no longer as stable, and this changes everything. Underwater survival depends on fine, almost surgical control. And when this control begins to slip, the body feels it before the mind accepts it. Visibility worsens. Particles in the water seem to multiply, and the environment becomes more enclosed, more oppressive. Communication, which was already limited, simply ceases to be a reliable option. The silence, which was previously just part of the scenery, now weighs in a different way. Among Navy SEALs, this is the point where attention needs to double, precisely when it becomes most difficult to maintain it. The biggest problem is that failure doesn't shout. It whispers. The diver notices small signs, but still believes he can correct everything quickly. Ultimately, Navy SEAL training prepares you for technical failures, unforeseen events, and extreme situations. But here, it's not a single problem, but rather several small ones happening simultaneously. The body starts working harder, the mind starts racing, and this combination is dangerous. The military mindset teaches composure, but underwater reality demands more than discipline. It demands full awareness. Failure occurs when effort ceases to be efficient. It's not yet panic, but it's no longer control. It's unstable terrain, where every decision carries double the weight. And in this terrain, the mind begins to give clear signs that it's about to enter into conflict with itself. Panic doesn't arrive running. It creeps in. First, breathing quickens only slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if the body were merely adjusting. For a Navy SEAL trained to operate under stress, this change seems manageable. But the body begins to draw in more air than it needs, and the mind tries to keep up with this erratic rhythm. Thoughts arise out of order, fragmented, like pieces of a puzzle that no longer fit. The near-death experience doesn't begin with explicit terror, it begins with confusion. The focus, once sharp, scatters. The water seems closer, heavier. Navy SEAL survival requires fine control, and this control begins to slip through the simplest details. The silence now sounds too loud, and when the silence screams, it's a sign that something has changed inside. The mind, accustomed to the military mindset, tries to regain control, but encounters resistance from the body itself. The heart races, vision seems to narrow, and the sense of time becomes distorted. Every second seems both too long and too short at the same time. Panic control is one of the pillars of mental resilience, but no one is immune to its onset. Not even elite soldiers. The danger here is not fear itself, but the gradual loss of the ability to think clearly. When the mind begins to lose control, decisions start to be made impulsively. There is no total collapse yet, but the ground is already prepared. Panic is born when the mind stops leading and starts reacting, and this subtle change opens the way for the most dangerous thought of all, which begins to form soon after. It's curious how the mind, under extreme pressure, seeks shortcuts. When air seems insufficient and the body sends urgent signals, a simple, direct, and dangerously convincing thought arises. I need to get out of here now. For a Navy SEAL accustomed to acting quickly, this phrase sounds almost logical. After all, acting is what Navy SEALs do best. The problem is that, in that context, urgency is not accompanied by clarity. The near-death experience begins to take shape when the mind confuses speed with solution. The brain begins to prioritize any immediate exit, ignoring protocols, training, and context. The military mindset teaches action, but it also teaches timing, and this detail begins to be forgotten. The thought seems to offer relief, but it carries a silent risk. Impulsive decisions consume what little control remains. This is the moment when many elite soldiers cross an invisible line. The idea of solving it now overrides the cold analysis of the situation. The body wants to ascend, wants to escape, wants to break with everything at once. However, in underwater survival, haste is the direct enemy of life. Breathing accelerates even more. Oxygen is depleted in precious seconds, and the mind enters a cycle of reaction instead of command. Panic control begins to fail precisely because the decision stems from fear, not strategy. Collapse doesn't happen suddenly. It begins when the mind accepts that any movement is better than none. And while this thought gains strength, the environment remains indifferent, setting the stage for a disorientation that is already knocking at the door. disorientation arrives like a slow blackout. For a Navy SEAL, accustomed to operating with precision, losing the sense of up and down is more than confusing. It's profoundly destabilizing. The body spins slightly, the water seems to push from all sides, and no reference point responds. What was once navigation becomes guesswork. Underwater survival depends on minimal orientation, and when it disappears, the body begins to feel heavy, as if trapped by its own equipment. The legs no longer respond with the same firmness. The arms seem to lag behind thought. The mind tries to find logic where there is only darkness. It is at this point that many Navy SEALs describe the sensation of being outside their own body, as if observing an error without being able to correct it immediately. The near-death experience ceases to be abstract and becomes physical. The absolute darkness is not just visual, it's mental. Without references, the brain enters into conflict with itself, alternating between acting and freezing. The military mindset teaches to maintain direction, but there is no clear direction there. The silence weighs more heavily than ever, and every second seems to drain energy. The heavy body pulls downward, while the mind still insists on finding a quick way out. Control over panic becomes increasingly fragile, because disorientation silently fuels fear. It's a dangerous cycle. The less clarity, the more tension. The more tension, the less clarity. Even for elite soldiers, this is rarely visited territory where training is brutally tested. And when all seems lost, when the darkness seems complete, the diver approaches emotional depths, a point no one forgets after crossing it. Reaching emotional rock bottom isn't about physical depth, but about internal exhaustion. For a Navy SEAL, this point is terrifying precisely because there's no longer the strength to negotiate with the body. Muscles no longer respond as before. Breathing fails to find a rhythm, and the mind begins to shut down parts to conserve energy. The near-death experience ceases to be a distant idea and begins to manifest in simple sensations: heaviness, slowness, absolute silence. The water seems colder, denser, as if it were pulling you down intentionally. Navy SEAL survival has always taught resistance, but there, resistance doesn't come from effort. It comes from accepting that something needs to change immediately. The body begins to give up before the mind realizes it, and that scares even the most prepared. At this stage, consciousness fluctuates. Thoughts arise and disappear too quickly, like sparks that don't become a flame. The mental resilience, so valued among Navy SEALs and Special Forces, seems distant, almost inaccessible. The exhaustion isn't just physical, it's emotional. There's a strange sense of ending, not dramatic, but silent, as if the body were preparing to shut down. Panic control is no longer actively exercised. It's replaced by a kind of emptiness. For many elite soldiers, this is the most dangerous point, because it doesn't scream for help. It simply shuts down. And it's precisely at this limit, when everything seems too dark and too slow, that something old, almost forgotten, begins to try to resurface in the mind. It's curious how the human mind stores certain phrases in deep, almost inaccessible places, waiting for the right moment to retrieve them. On the verge of exhaustion, when everything seems too dark, something ancient begins to emerge. For a Navy SEAL, this something usually comes from Navy SEAL training, repeated so many times that it becomes part of the subconscious. It doesn't emerge as a shout, but as a firm whisper, almost too calm for the surrounding chaos. A simple phrase, forgotten in daily life, reappears with unexpected force. It's the last thread of clarity stretching to avoid breaking. The military mindset was built precisely for these moments, when the body fails and only the mind can take over. Among Navy SEALs, it's learned that training isn't for easy days, but for the seconds when thinking seems impossible. This memory doesn't solve everything immediately, but it changes the internal direction. The mind, which was reacting, slowly begins to regain control. Panic control doesn't happen all at once. It begins with a small adjustment of attention. The thought shifts from "get out now" to "what else can I do?" The mental resilience, so crucial in Special Forces, shows its true value here, far from any audience. Even in a true story of Navy SEAL survival, this moment isn't grand. It's silent, intimate, almost invisible, but it's decisive. Because when the mind remembers who it was trained to be, the chaos loses some of its power. And this small space created within despair opens the way for something essential, the conscious choice to stop, even when everything around demands movement. To stop, in that context, seems absurd. Everything in a Navy SEAL's body has been trained to act, react, and advance. But there, in the midst of underwater chaos, stopping doesn't mean giving up. It means surviving. It's a conscious interruption of the cycle of error. The diver stops fighting the water, stops responding to the immediate impulse, and creates a rare internal space. Underwater survival demands this kind of silent courage. Panic control begins precisely at this point, when the mind decides to take command again, even if the body is still on high alert. Among Navy SEALs, one learns that stopping is not weakness, it's strategy. It's recognizing that persisting in error costs more than enduring a few seconds of absolute discomfort. The chaos continues around, but something changes inside. Accepting the moment is not resignation, it's an accurate reading of reality. The diver recognizes where he is, recognizes the current limit, and this returns some of the lost control. The military mentality teaches that mastering a situation begins with understanding it without illusions. By interrupting the panic, the mind stops wasting energy on fear and begins to use this scarce resource to think. The mental resilience, so demanded in Navy SEAL training, appears here in its purest form. There is no visible heroism, no grand gesture, only an internal, firm, and silent decision. And this decision changes everything. Because by stopping, the diver creates the minimum conditions for something even more powerful to happen, regaining control of their breathing, which will be the next step in resuming their own life. Breathing, something so simple out of the water, becomes a sophisticated skill there. For a Navy SEAL, breathing ceases to be automatic and becomes a conscious tool for underwater survival. Each inhalation needs to be measured, each exhalation controlled. It's not about taking in more air, it's about expending less. The body is still on alert, but the mind begins to impose a new rhythm. This fine-tuning is a direct result of Navy SEAL training, where one learns that oxygen is life, and life is managed with discipline. Breathing slows the heart, calms the muscles, organizes thoughts. Gradually, the environment ceases to seem like an immediate enemy. Silence becomes just silence again, no longer a threat. Among Navy SEALs, this mastery of breathing is one of the pillars of mental resilience, because it is there that the body begins to obey again. When the rhythm stabilizes, something powerful happens inside. The mind realizes that there is still room for control. Calm under pressure doesn't arise from nothing. It is born from this conscious commitment to the basics. Inhale. Exhale. Nothing more than that for a few precious seconds. Panic control strengthens as the body understands it is no longer in immediate danger. For elite soldiers, this is a silent, almost invisible, but profoundly transformative turning point. Breathing becomes an anchor, it becomes a reference point, and with it, clarity begins to return. The diver hasn't yet overcome the problem, but has recovered something essential: time. And when you gain time, you gain the chance to think better, opening space for smarter decisions that begin to form soon after. With breathing under control, the mind finally finds space to do what seemed impossible minutes before: to think. For a Navy SEAL, this moment is precious. Thinking before acting is not hesitation, it's strategy. The mind begins to organize the scenario, separating what is a real threat from what is merely the noise of fear. Navy SEAL training exists precisely for this: to create clarity when chaos tries to dominate. Options are coldly evaluated, even if the body is still tired. Small decisions become highly valuable. Where to conserve energy? How to use the environment to one's advantage? The military mindset silently kicks in, guiding choices that don't attract attention but save lives. It is at this point that the survival story begins to change direction. Thinking there is an act of courage. Instead of reacting to impulse, the diver chooses to trust what they have learned over the years. Mental resilience manifests in the ability to keep a clear mind under extreme pressure. For Navy SEALs and other elite soldiers, Acting without thinking is a luxury that only exists outside of hostile environments. Here, every movement needs to be intentional. Calmness under pressure ceases to be a concept and becomes practice. The mind understands that force without direction is wasted, and that survival doesn't require haste, it requires precision. By thinking before acting, the diver begins to see solutions that were previously hidden by panic. And this clarity paves the way for the most important decision of all, which is about to be made. The right decision is rarely the most obvious, it's almost always the most economical. For a Navy SEAL, making the right decision under pressure is the pinnacle of military thinking. Instead of grand movements, he chooses the smallest ones. He adjusts his body to the water's flow, reduces the area of resistance, lets the current work in his favor, not against him. It's underwater survival applied in practice, the result of years of Navy SEAL training. The mind, now clear, understands that every unnecessary gesture costs oxygen, time, and energy. The decision isn't dramatic, it's precise. It doesn't draw attention, but it changes everything. Navy SEALs learn early on that winning sometimes means knowing when not to fight. And there, in that heavy silence, that lesson takes shape. Working with the environment demands humility, something rare even among elite soldiers. The water ceases to be the enemy and becomes a variable to be used. Panic control is maintained because the decision stems from clarity, not fear. Mental resilience sustains focus while the body executes the plan with patience. This is how a true Navy SEAL survival story unfolds. Without noisy heroism, without unnecessary force. The right decision creates a new rhythm, slower, safer, more intelligent. And in that rhythm, something begins to happen around, not within. The environment responds. The darkness seems less absolute. Small signs emerge. And it is at this point that hope appears, not as euphoria, but as a concrete possibility. Hope, when it truly arrives, doesn't come in the form of euphoria. It appears discreetly, almost timidly, like a detail that only those who are attentive can perceive. For a Navy SEAL, trained to operate at the limit, this first sign emerges as a subtle change in the environment. A distant beam. A slight contrast in the darkness. Nothing grandiose. Nothing cinematic. Just enough to say, there is still a way out. In a near-death experience, the mind learns not to cling to fantasies. Focus remains. Breathing remains controlled. Calm under pressure is maintained because survival is not yet guaranteed. Among Navy SEALs, it is learned that hope without discipline becomes error. Therefore, even when faced with the possibility of rescue, the diver does not rush. He observes, confirms, maintains his position. Underwater survival demands patience until the last second. The most important thing at this moment is not the light itself, but the posture in the face of it. The control of panic, achieved with so much effort, cannot be lost now. The military mindset teaches that the greatest danger often arises when you believe all is lost. Therefore, the body remains economical, movements are kept minimal, and the mind remains clear. Correct hope doesn't distract, it guides. For elite soldiers, this balance between expectation and caution is fundamental. The survival story doesn't end when help arrives, but when it materializes. And while the light slowly approaches, the diver knows, deep down, that he still needs to do the hardest part. Maintain confidence without lowering his guard, preparing for the contact that is about to happen. Contact doesn't happen like in the movies. There's no rush, no immediate relief. First come the hands. Firm, secure. Hands that don't tremble because they've been there before. For a Navy SEAL, this touch represents more than help. It represents absolute trust. Trust built in Navy SEAL training, repeated in silence, far from any stage. The exhausted body accepts the support without resistance. There's no pride, no dispute with reality. Only cooperation. Navy SEAL survival has always been collective, even when everything seems lonely. The rescue doesn't erase the danger, but it reorganizes the scenario. Breathing remains controlled, the mind remains alert. Because until you're out of the water, everything still matters. Every movement is calculated, every gesture has intention. At that moment, something profound happens inside. Life begins to be resumed, not with euphoria, but with seriousness. Navy SEALs learn early on that surviving isn't a reason for immediate celebration. It's a reason for respect. The near-death experience leaves silent marks, and the body knows this before the mind processes it. The military mindset keeps everyone focused on the procedure, not the emotional outcome. Panic control, hard won, isn't abandoned at the last minute. For elite soldiers, trust in the team is as vital as oxygen. And as the rescue progresses, something solidifies internally. This wasn't just an extreme situation overcome, it was a frontier crossed. And crossing frontiers always changes someone, preparing the ground for the reunion with the surface, and with everything that comes after. Breaking the surface isn't just about breathing air again. It's crossing an invisible border between two states of existence. When the face emerges, the air rushes in too forcefully, almost burning from the inside. For a Navy SEAL, that first breath doesn't bring immediate relief, it brings reality. The body trembles without asking permission, not just from cold, but from the shock of returning. The near-death experience takes its toll in that instant. The heart beats erratically, the hands still don't obey properly, and the mind becomes strangely silent. There are no words, no celebration, just the raw sensation of being alive. A Navy SEAL's survival has never been about victory, it's always been about continuing. And at that moment, continuing simply means existing a little longer, breathing, feeling, accepting. The mind, accustomed to the military mentality, enters a curious state of productive emptiness. It doesn't think about what happened, nor what could have happened. It simply remains quiet. Panic control is no longer necessary, but the body still carries its echoes. For Navy SEALs and other elite soldiers, this post-crisis silence is common and necessary. It's the interval between danger and understanding. The air returns, the body still trembles, but something stabilizes inside. There is no euphoria, because euphoria distracts. There is presence. And this presence, dense and silent, prepares the ground for the next moment, when the external environment calms down, but the internal impact truly begins to reveal itself. On the boat, time passes differently. There's no urgency, no rush to speak. A Navy SEAL's body rests heavily, as if each muscle is finally paying the price for what it has spent. Water drips from the equipment onto the metal floor, and this simple sound seems louder than any word. There's no celebration, no pat on the back. Among Navy SEALs, silence is a sign of respect. The real story is still being digested, cell by cell. Breathing is returning to normal, but the fatigue is profound, almost ancestral. The near-death experience isn't resolved when the danger passes. It begins to be understood precisely when everything becomes too quiet. The body is there, present, but the mind still navigates deeper waters. The military mindset teaches that reflection doesn't require discourse, it requires inner honesty. Sitting there, enveloped by the gentle rocking of the sea, the diver begins to revisit each decision, not with guilt, but with curiosity. Mental resilience now manifests itself in another way, accepting what happened without running away from the emotional discomfort. For elite soldiers, this post-event period is as important as the event itself. It is in this period that learning takes hold. Controlling panic is no longer necessary, but the memory of it remains, like a silent warning. Nothing is said, but everything is felt. And in this charged silence, a question begins to form, preparing the ground for the deeper understanding that is about to emerge. True understanding doesn't arrive as a brilliant insight, one that suddenly lights up. It comes slowly, almost timidly, as the mind revisits critical moments. For a Navy SEAL, accustomed to facing external threats, this realization is uncomfortable. The real enemy wasn't in the sea, nor in the current, nor in the darkness. It was within. The silent, persistent panic was the most dangerous factor in that true story. The near-death experience makes this clear in a way that no book or instruction can teach. The ocean simply did what it always does. What changed the game was the internal reaction. Among Navy SEALs, this realization hurts the ego, but strengthens character. The military mindset doesn't romanticize mistakes. It transforms them into learning experiences. And there, in the silence after the event, the lesson begins to take shape with uncomfortable clarity. Panic and clarity don't coexist. One drives out the other. This simple truth becomes impossible to ignore after a survival story like this. Panic control isn't a training detail. It's the heart of Navy SEAL survival. Mental resilience, so often discussed among elite soldiers and special forces, reveals its true meaning. It's not about enduring more pain, but about preserving lucidity when everything calls for despair. Clarity doesn't eliminate danger, but it prevents it from multiplying. This understanding changes how risk is perceived. The diver realizes that force without direction almost killed him, while calm under pressure saved him. And when this truth takes hold, it's not confined to the sea. It begins to weigh on the mind, demanding to be applied to something greater, outside that extreme environment. After going through such an experience, no one returns exactly the same. For a Navy SEAL, the change isn't visible in the uniform or the resume. It happens internally. Something silently reorganizes itself. The diver begins to see risk with different eyes, less arrogant and more attentive. The real-life story lived at the bottom of the sea dismantles old certainties and builds a new foundation of respect for the unpredictable. Among Navy SEALs, this transformation is common, but rarely verbalized. The near-death experience doesn't create fear. It creates awareness. The military mindset remains firm, but more mature. The individual understands that survival wasn't just a result of strength or technique, but of humility in the face of the moment. And this perception changes how they position themselves in the face of any challenge, big or small. This new perspective alters the relationship with control. Before, control meant dominating the environment. Now it means dominating oneself. For elite soldiers, this internal shift is profound. Mental resilience takes on a broader meaning, less linked to suffering and more linked to lucidity. Controlling panic ceases to be merely a trained skill and becomes a personal value. The survival of a Navy SEAL is no longer seen as an isolated feat, but as a continuous learning process. The man who emerges from this experience carries fewer absolute certainties and more intelligent questions. And it is these questions that begin to push him out of the military environment into the ordinary world, where different crises demand the same calm under pressure learned at the bottom of the ocean. When the water recedes and everyday life takes over again, the lesson doesn't disappear. It simply changes scenery. What was learned at the bottom of the ocean is now tested in much more common and, paradoxically, more difficult to perceive environments. For a Navy SEAL, applying this experience outside the sea means recognizing that everyday crises can also cause shortness of breath. Work pressure, personal conflicts, urgent decisions. All of this activates the same internal triggers that almost led to collapse. The military mindset helps to identify these patterns quickly. The survival story ceases to be just an extreme episode and becomes a silent reference. The body already knows the path to panic, and the mind now knows the way back. This changes everything. In the civilian world, nobody shouts danger before the crisis arrives. It appears disguised as urgency, expectation, or fear of making a mistake. And that's where mental resilience makes a real difference. Calmness under pressure, trained in Navy SEAL survival, becomes an invisible advantage. Controlling panic allows one to pause before reacting, think before deciding, breathe before responding. For elite soldiers, this adaptation is a continuous learning process, because outside of special forces, the chaos is quieter yet constant. Each decision made with clarity reinforces the lesson learned at sea. And the more it is applied, the more evident it becomes that that night was not an isolated event, but a milestone that prepares the ground for a philosophy of life that begins to reveal itself. Over time, experience ceases to be a memory and becomes philosophy. For a Navy SEAL, this philosophy isn't born from pretty phrases, but from experiences that almost cost everything. The understanding that not everything can be overcome with force begins to silently guide choices. Forcing too much, insisting beyond what is necessary, fighting against what cannot be controlled, all of this takes on a different meaning after a true story of Navy SEAL survival. The military mentality remains present, but now balanced with discernment. Force still exists, but subordinated to clarity. Among Navy SEALs, one learns that discipline is not rigidity, but intelligent adaptation. And this philosophy is built in the detail, in the restrained gesture, in the decision that seems simple, but avoids the biggest mistake. Calmness, previously seen only as a technique, becomes understood as a trainable and indispensable skill. Calmness under pressure doesn't eliminate challenges, but prevents them from growing unnecessarily. For elite soldiers, this perception redefines the concept of leadership, including internal leadership. Mental resilience ceases to be synonymous with enduring pain and begins to mean maintaining lucidity when everything tries to steal it. Panic control becomes a conscious choice, repeated daily. This philosophy doesn't promise a life without crises, but it offers something more valuable: the ability to get through them without getting lost. And when this understanding solidifies, it begins to point to something even broader, almost universal, that transcends any uniform or extreme context. As time goes by, it becomes impossible to ignore a simple truth. Everyone faces moments of breathlessness in life. It doesn't matter if you're a Navy SEAL or an ordinary person dealing with everyday problems. The pressure changes form, but the internal effect is the same. The heart races, the mind narrows, and the impulse to solve everything immediately takes over. The survival story lived in the ocean reveals that the bottom is rarely physical. It's mental. The near-death experience only makes this impossible to deny. Among Navy SEALs, it's learned that the environment doesn't create the collapse. It only reveals what was already disorganized inside. The military mindset helps to recognize this pattern quickly, but the lesson applies to anyone who has ever felt pressured beyond their limit. This teaching transcends contexts, professions, and personal histories. Mental resilience is not a privilege of elite soldiers or special forces. It is a human skill that can be developed. Calmness under pressure doesn't eliminate the problem, but it prevents it from becoming something bigger. Controlling panic doesn't mean the absence of fear, but rather the presence of awareness. Just like in underwater survival, life demands strategic pauses before action. Those who learn this begin to realize that external chaos only wins when it encounters internal disorder. And this perception prepares the ground for something even more practical and powerful. A simple, almost obvious sequence that saves decisions, relationships, and sometimes lives. Some phrases don't impress at first glance. They're too simple, too direct, almost banal. Precisely for that reason, they work when everything falls apart. For a Navy SEAL, this short sequence becomes a mental anchor amidst the chaos. Stop, breathe, think, act. It's not a pretty mantra, it's a survival protocol. At the bottom of the sea, during that near-death experience, this phrase didn't emerge as inspiration, but as a tool. It cuts through mental noise, organizes what's chaotic, and returns control to the mind. Among Navy SEALs, they learn that simplicity saves when complexity paralyzes. The military mindset values this type of structure because it works under real pressure. It doesn't require strength, it requires presence, and presence is something that panic tries to steal first. The power of this phrase lies in the order. Stopping interrupts error. Breathing gives back time. Thinking creates clarity. Acting then becomes a consequence, not an impulse. This logic sustains mental resilience in extreme environments and also outside of them. In Navy SEAL survival, acting without stopping beforehand almost always comes at a high price. Panic control is born precisely in that interval created by conscious pause. For elite soldiers, this sequence becomes an internal habit, repeated until it becomes automatic. And when something is automatic, it appears even when everything seems lost. This phrase doesn't promise comfort, it promises lucidity. And this lucidity, once experienced, begins to demand something greater, a final reflection on what the ocean truly taught when everything fell silent. The ocean has never been just a backdrop. It has always been a silent metaphor for life itself. calm on the surface, unpredictable in its depths. For a Navy SEAL, this understanding comes early, but only truly takes hold after a near-death experience. Deep down, far from any human noise, the sea teaches without words. It shows that fighting against everything is exhausting, that ignoring signs is costly, and that haste almost always leads to error. The real story lived there doesn't need to be explained to make sense. It is felt. Among Navy SEALs, one learns that silence is not emptiness. It is a demanding teacher. The military mindset matures when it understands that listening to silence is as important as acting. And it is in this silent space that clarity begins to replace chaos. Silence, after the internal storm, organizes thoughts that were previously scattered. Mental resilience ceases to be an effort and becomes a state. Calm under pressure begins to accompany small and large decisions, both on and off the sea. For elite soldiers and anyone attentive, this lesson resonates. It's not the environment that defines the outcome, it's the internal response. The survival of a Navy SEAL shows that clarity doesn't eliminate risks, but it prevents them from multiplying. When chaos loses its power, space remains for awareness. And this awareness, once awakened, doesn't fade easily. It remains silent, ready to be activated the next time life seems to take your breath away, preparing the ground for everything that can still be learned afterward. Perhaps the greatest lesson of this story isn't at the bottom of the ocean, but in what it awakens after everything calms down. Life, like the sea, doesn't warn you when it's going to change its mood. One day it's stable, the next it demands more than you imagine you have to offer. That's why continuity matters. Not that momentary excitement, but the silent persistence of someone who learns to observe before reacting. A Navy SEAL doesn't survive by doing something grandiose just once, but by repeating simple fundamentals every day, even when no one is watching. And this applies to anyone who wants to get through difficult phases without getting lost in them. Daily awareness is this: perceiving your own rhythm, recognizing when the mind starts to race, when panic tries to take the wheel. The military mindset teaches that clarity doesn't come from chance, it comes from habit. Calm under pressure doesn't appear in extreme moments if it isn't practiced in ordinary moments. Maybe you'll come back to this video another day, in another phase, and notice something different. That's a sign of growth. Stories like this aren't exhausted in a single listening session. They accompany you. If it makes sense to you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the videos that are posted every day. Here, every piece of content is designed to help you breathe better, think more clearly, and move forward with more awareness.